Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Tuesday, June the 6th. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy of Politico. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's, the podcast that brings you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics.
Oh, by the way, Anne, as an aside at the end of yesterday's show, I jokingly suggested that for more details of the pensions changes that we were talking about, listeners tune in to our sister show, Actuarial Calculations with Sam and Anne. Well, overnight, an advisor to the pensions industry has actually been in touch because they fleshed out exactly such a proposal.
I'd really like to hear a bit more from them, and we could get some more lie-ins, and I can finally get my pension sorted out and just head to the golf course.
They sent me an 8-page document outlining a business case, who the audience would be, who the potential sponsor would be, and pointing out there's a gap in the market for a more honest conversation about pensions as the system shifts to a greater focus on personal responsibility. Yes, take that. The rest is entertainment. Other podcast audiences fill the Albert Hall and buy fan merch. Ours spend time dreaming whether we might say things like auto-enrollment has been a game changer, but is it also a policy area ripe for debate? I, for one, embrace and love this. Our audience know us. We know them. We love it. We never pretended we were cool.
Well, maybe you didn't pretend you were cool. But right on with this morning. For the cool cats, the negotiations of Wednesday's spending review are complete. The last cabinet holdout, Yvette Cooper, has settled with the Chancellor with reports that Rachel Reeves has refused to meet the Home Secretary's demand for extra police funding that doesn't come from budgets external to existing commitments at the Home Office.
Gosh, I mean, knowing those two characters, I'm absolutely sure we haven't heard the end of that one.
I don't think so either. And one aspect of this spending review is that it has changed in a couple of cases, Sam. I think maybe worsened some of the dynamics in cabinet. There is no doubt that it went down to the wire as Yvette Cooper went back again and again for talks with Rachel Reeves, the Treasury. We read this morning that she also cited Labour's pledge to address knife crime and community policing and said she needed money for that. She couldn't do it without extra funding sources. Politico Playbook also follows up a story that we chatted about yesterday, raising more concerns that London would lose funding going forward into the next years. And a figure close to the Mayor, Sadiq Khan, has told us that if the Treasury goes ahead with this cut, it would be, quote, incredibly short-sighted. They say they want economic growth, this source says, but their actions in failing to invest in new infrastructure in the capital and cutting local growth funds will damage our economy, not improve it. That's pretty full frontal, isn't it? It's sort of Sadiq Khan, or should we say Team Sadiq Khan, but I don't think that happens without his say-so, going sort of Andy Burnham for the South.
That's really interesting. One of the fascinating dynamics at the moment is having hugged them close. The mayors could actually, even though they're Labour mayors, be quite troublesome for this government. Somebody I was chatting to yesterday was saying that, you know, the mayors are slightly frustrated with the way the Labour government's operating and are looking to, perhaps even, in the words of one of them, appointing Andy Burnham as the person who will rattle the government's cages. I'm sure he will find it very hard to take on that mantle, selfless man that he is. But I think people like Burnham and Khan are going to be louder, more oppositional voices to this government.
Interesting.
Also in the run-up to the spending review, the government is trumpeting the biggest build-out of nuclear power in half a century, £14.2 billion over 4 years for the sizable Sea power station. It's actually going down pretty well in the papers this morning and amongst pro-growth Labour MPs. But one of the questions we're going to explore is Ed Miliband's department not going to be able to do as much in other areas like GB energy or carbon capture and storage?
I have a slightly wonky interest in nuclear facilities, so can we come back to that as a treat to me in just a moment?
Definitely can.
Great. And Reform UK having a press conference that just feels like a daily occurrence right now. They're going to be announcing a new party chairman to replace Zia Youssef. The Mail is speculating it could be David Bell. Reform UK aren't confirming that. We will find out at 11 this morning. But it is Tuesday, and that is weekly polling numbers day. What are the scores on the doors?
Yeah, so this week's YouGov, Sky News, Times, weekly voting intention, of course, sampled over the weekend, has Reform UK out on top, up one at 29%, Labour second on 23, up one on the week, Conservatives on 17%, down one, Lib Dems on 15, Greens on 10. So all the movement since last week within the margin of error. And I think we're about to move into a period, I'd say over the next month or so, where it's worth keeping quite a close eye on this, because first of all, Reform UK are quite close to the psychologically important 30%. It would only be a movement within the margin of error, but numbers matter to the mood and the vibe in politics. But also, we're entering a good period to monitor the polls, because I will be fascinated to see how the winter fuel U-turn that we'll come on to in a second has impacted Labour's numbers. Of course, this poll was taken before anybody would have noticed Rachel Reeves' announcement. But the bottom line is, if you look into the sort of tables of the polling, as I've done early this morning, Labour is the most unpopular amongst the over 65. So just 14% back Labour in the over 65s category. So the question is, does that number go up? And in about a month's time, we should come back and see whether 14 has gone up or whether it's still the damage has been done and is staying done.
I mean, that also raises the criticism that we've heard a lot in the last few hours from those who say there's just such a big skew now in the system towards older voters. But when you look at that voting profile as polled, you can see why Labour is keen to get some of those voters back. But it does come at a cost, and it comes at a cost of more money going into that U-turn that could have gone to families, working families, and those on benefits for poorer families with dependents. On with today, however, and the Chancellor will make a speech at the GMB annual Congress where she'll commit the money needed to build Sizewell C. The government says it's ushering in a new golden age of nuclear in the biggest nuclear power building programme in a generation, providing clean power for millions of homes, etc., thousands of jobs. This is about 14.2 billion for Sizewell C, powering 6 million homes. I noticed a little bit has been shaved off that, but I think that's because the investment is now coming proportionately more from the UK than elsewhere. Confirmation that the small modular reactors competition results will be announced very shortly, and major backing for fusion technology. After over a decade of false starts and some stuttering around the Labour government going big on nuclear, the biggest build-out, they say, of nuclear power in half a century.
I mean, for those who don't remember the backstory, what happened in the UK and the reason that nuclear is effectively so expensive in the UK is because of a coalition-era decision, so that was 2010 to 2015, where Lib Dems and Nick Clegg basically blocked new nuclear. And in effect, some of the projects continued, but it started more or less. We're having to reboot the industry from scratch at a much higher cost to the taxpayer. And that starting position is pretty bleak, right? There was a goal set by Boris Johnson for a target of 24 gigawatts of nuclear power to be produced by nuclear by 2050. And as far as we know, Labour is sticking to that figure, but we're only at 6 out of the 24 gigawatts. Now, 2050 is a long time away, but that's a long way to go. Sizewell, well, that alone is 3.2 gigawatts. So we're not talking about something that's going to actually help us reach that target, but we've got to get there. We're only going to get there incrementally. It's going to need more large plants like Sizewell and Hinckley. I think the next one is a large plant expected in North Wales. The government bought the site a few years back. We'll get there. But there are sort of two big buts with what's going on and the sort of questions around that. So Sizewell C is the thing that's got the kind of green light today. But it's a replica of Hinkley Point, which itself has had lots of delays. Now, the industry would tell us that they've learned from the problems that Hinkley had. But Hinkley itself is based on something in France. It's a nuclear power station in Flamanville, which uses this technology called European pressurized reactors. And that has also had just a hell of a lot of design headaches going back over years. And so I just think the whole nature of the reactor that the government is the type of reactor that the government's doubling down on is tricky, which sort of flows very neatly to the second point, which is all these kind of design risks are now being borne much more by the taxpayer here. Now, you just have to get that done, but it is costing a lot. This is a new funding model, which means that private investors will have to, share a large chunk of the risk. But ministers have also agreed to take a chunky stake in Sizewell C. The Times says it's a bigger stake. Some government sources are disputing that, but can't give me the exact figures and say that the nuclear strategy will be released in due course. But it's clearly something to watch. But under this funding model, investors carry risk of cost overruns, but are then paid back through consumer bills and can make more money if the project comes in on budget and on time. So it's an attempt to square off the cycle. But the bottom line is taxpayers and bill payers paying more.
Indeed. And I think it's fascinating, Sam, when we talk about these mega projects, how much they rely on a mix of really putting a lot of money in there through the British taxpayer with the prospect that a lot of it will come back. But that is always, of course, open to question depending on other factors. How much they also still rely on globalized investment models in order to create that self-reliant sort of UK energy. It's a sort of paradox. And one of the big players here is Enke UK, which is a subsidiary of a massive Turkish company also involved in the construction of a hydrogen plant. And that dialing back of Chinese investment in the nuclear mix has had to be made up from elsewhere as well. So we're seeing other players come in there. But I cannot see that this has happened without overall increasing the government stake. It's interesting that you set that challenge and whether we hear any figures back from that, because there has been quite a retreat of Chinese investment. And yes, there are others in the mix, but I think it also just means more coming in on the UK side.
Right. We should just talk a little bit about the woman of the moment, the woman of the week, Rachel Reeves. Now, I went to interview her yesterday because she was announcing that winter fuel U-turn, which it wasn't a mini or a medium-sized reversal. It was a maxi reversal. 9 out of the 11 million pensioners will now get to keep in full the £300 winter fuel payment that they get in the autumn to help with bills. Now, this was something that she did because she said it was an economic imperative in July, the first month that she was Chancellor. Now, there's a £1 billion black hole in the budget. She hasn't said how she's going to pay for it. It is the product of fraught conversations at the top of government with Number 10 and inside the Parliamentary Labour Party with differing views. But there she was out defending it. I had quite, I suppose you could call it an edgy encounter with her. Anne, before I give sort of my reflections, you actually watched it as well. What did you make of the Chancellor when I met her yesterday?
Well, in fairness to Rachel Reeves, you were in sort of Robo-Sam mode, peppering her with questions. I'm sorry, Rachel, I know what it's like. You were peppering her with questions, on the inconsistencies, on where the money was going to come from, etc. And you could sort of feel that there was a bit of a guard up there, perhaps a day or so before the spending review. That's not surprising, but she did want to put across her case. What struck me was that there is still a fundamental reliance when it comes to discussing the economy and spending changes in this government on, if you like, the greatest hits, the 22 billion black hole left by the Tories, surprisingly or not, was wheeled out. We heard something quite similar that a lot of people were talking about. I was out and about last night from Keir Starmer, effectively supporting the opening of that checkbook on the winter fuel allowance reversal, but saying that the economy had improved enough for this to happen, rather than, I was actually speaking to a very senior former Conservative strategist saying, like, you voters are not daft. Why don't you just say we've changed our mind, rather than saying that suddenly there are green shoots all over the economy, so we've decided to go back on something that we did not even a year ago. But what was your impression, Sam?
So the tricky thing is, first of all, she doesn't want to concede any mistake was made, even though by junking it, they are conceding a mistake was made. So there was just a fundamental plausibility gap in the way she was handling the questions. She was trying to tell us that she had got some good news. And the second thing is that the reason that she had good news, even though it was reversing her own bad news, was because the economy is in a much better place. But again, although there are one or two things that are a little bit better, interest rates are coming down, although perhaps not as fast as they might have done because of some government decisions. And there is 1 month of particularly solid GDP growth. There is so much uncertainty. The OBR halved this year's growth forecast. The OECD downgraded UK growth just last week. And we just don't know what's going to happen with Trump and tariffs, which are still very much impacting and will be very much impacting the UK economy. The idea that you can tell people that things are going gangbusters when they're not, it seems very weird. Normally you'd expect somebody else in government to be trying that one on, not the Chancellor. But everything I'm hearing suggests that it's Rachel Reeves personally who has been stung by political attacks around the winter fuel allowance and is sort of driving some of these U-turns, certainly faster than some in number 10 would do. So it wasn't a comfortable encounter. I mean, I did actually use the line that I'm not sure anyone else would have used. I asked her whether she was cosplaying fiscal discipline, but that is sort of, it's hard to mount the argument that you are the most fiscally concerned Chancellor when you are doing £1 billion U-turns and not saying how you're going to pay for them.
And look at the pressure point the other way around as well, Sam, if looking at the response that we're reporting this morning from the Unite union boss, Sharon Graham, who gives this quite a kind of cold reception. It's an interesting analysis that you put there. There's actually Rachel Reeves, who was maybe leaning into the political disaffection even more so than number 10, which tends to be sort of code for Morgan McSweeney. Sharon Graham is saying, while this is an important step forward, questions will be asked about how this disastrous decision was made in the first place. The damage may not easily be reversed. So that wasn't like a big thank you there from Unite. Labour MPs clearly have been very vocal about this with number 10 and number 11. But a lot of those MPs, it seems quite likely, will move on to calling for action on other benefit cuts that Rachel Reeves will not, I think, want to give way on. And, of course, we have that two-child cap and the discussion about how far there is going to be a reversal on that. So, in a sense, they do seem to have opened a door to an expectation that they can reverse unpopular decisions very quickly.
There is a really, really interesting divide that I'm sensing. Okay, in the cabinet, you have quite a lot of people that you might call Blairites or modernisers or reformers of some sort who reflect a particular wing of the Labour Party, the Weses and the Peters. Darren Jones, to a certain extent, this has been a space that Rachel has been in herself. You've got, to a certain extent, Morgan McSweeney as part of that gang as well, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, who are very apprised of the need for Labour to feel like it's a party that you can trust on the economy. That's a dominant vibe in the cabinet. But what I'm told is in the wider parliamentary Labour's party, the soft left in the last few weeks and months have been mobilising and have been more vocal. So this is Miatta van Buller, it's Torsten Bell. These are characters in government, but are quite active on MP WhatsApp groups. Compass, the soft left campaign group, has stepped up a gear. And they, of course, are fans of shouting from the hilltops about bigger spending and how this is the no return to austerity. They're putting pressure on the Chancellor now. And it's interesting that you have one tendency in the cabinet and you have a louder tendency in bits of the PLP. And those two effectively are clashing, but it feels like Rachel Reeves is listening a little bit more to that parliamentary party concern, because I don't think the bulk of the new or the current parliamentary party does lean that kind of Wesite, Kyleite, Jonesite tendency in even though they're such loud voices in cabinet. And that is a fascinating dynamic that's going to play out over the next few weeks and months.
I think it's also worth remembering that Rachel Reeves was never really a Blairite herself either. I mean, the people that you cite who align behind her or alongside her were probably a bit in classic terms, a bit more to the right on the Labour spectrum than Rachel Reeves, at least in the formative years when I first knew her. I thought she was just closer to a sort of Gordon Brown position. But it's so interesting that you use that phrase, the soft left, and the people that you identify with it. I agree with that. But I think it's also interesting then to say, well, what's the difference then between the left of Labour and the soft left, if it just comes down to being a group which can coalesce to put spending pressures? The one thing they will definitely agree on is that they like more money to be spent, to put pressure on the Chancellor. So you get a new constellation. You call it the slushy left, I think, which is some of the real old kind of hardliners and people who would have been on board with the Corbyn era. And then, as you say, those who wouldn't have been, perhaps soft left, but the more left end of the Gordon Brown years. I realise that this taxonomy could go into a bit into the weeds, but I think you're onto something there. I think there's a constellation that is going to cause more pressure on the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, exactly as you're framing.
We've bust over our 20 minutes. All I'll say is nobody ever asked what Keir Starmer thinks, because they're not sure he thinks very much on this. And I know I'm being a bit rude, but you do hear that quite a lot. Anyway, on that stolen last word, I'm going to say we will see you tomorrow morning for the Spending Review Day. Super exciting. So have fun. Hold on tight. It's going to be a great West of the Week.
Right. I'm going to see you out and about tonight, and then it's Spending Review tomorrow. We don't want to miss that one.